On this week's episode of Scaffolds, I talk about the heat wave we're currently experiencing and its effect on insects, and go over information from the West Coast about woolly apple aphid. Kerik gives us a mid-season update on pathology, and Anna continues our state-of-the-state updates on degree day accumulations and trap captures. This week, we are in a major heat wave, so I thought it might be a good idea to explain what might be happening with insects generally. And then I'll be discussing a couple woolly apple aphid papers that I thought might be interesting to you. We don't have a guest to talk about them with, but I thought it would be fun to just give you some results of a couple papers that were published before anyhow. So when it comes to heat waves like the one that we're in, you may be thinking that, well, insects need heat units to develop. And that's true. Thinking of degree days, this is how we generally think about this. But what happens when we have a major heat event like this? They do have upper thresholds of development, but there can be some outcomes that are either desirable or not desirable. So one thing with more heat units, higher temperatures, if they're not too high, can speed up the growth and development of insects, which could also lead to increased reproduction. So there may be more development faster of the young, which can cause sometimes overlapping generations. This also can have an effect on their overall lifespan, so they can have an altered lifespan, and they may have shorter lifespans due to increased metabolic rates at these higher temperatures. Additionally, there could be developmental abnormalities in extreme heat. So depending on the species, this will be different for each species, you can see some developmental abnormalities. You can also see potential changes in behavior. So this can include their feeding behavior, mating, and movement patterns. So there might be less flight at peak temperatures. There may be less mating and even less feeding when you get to super high temperatures. And furthermore, it could cause increased mortality. So each insect is going to have an upper limit to their development. And also this could extend to this upper limit causing death. So prolonged exposure to super high temperatures can be lethal, but again, this is dependent on what specific insect species we're talking about. And unfortunately, for many species, there's not a lot of work on upper developmental thresholds. It's typically that lower one because that guides us as we go into the season starting in the spring. Furthermore, this can cause overall phenological shifts, meaning that the timing of life cycle events like egg hatching or migration can shift, which can lead to mismatches with food availability and predator activity or other biological control agent activity. Because we're in another year of woolly apple aphid, which we kindly call in my lab WA, which is the abbreviation WAA, so if I misspeak and say that a couple times throughout this, that's why. I wanted to talk about these two different papers on woolly apple aphid from the West Coast, discuss their results, and also just think a little bit about how this might work in a New York system. So both of these papers are from 2019, and the first one is titled Effects of Restricting Movement Between Root and Canopy Populations of Woolly Apple Aphid. And both of these papers come out of the lab of Dr. David Crowder. So in this paper, they make the argument that movement of the woolly apple aphid creates these spatially subdivided populations, meaning that, you have ones in the canopy, you have ones on the roots, you have ones feeding on pruning wounds, and making the argument that this can lead to recolonization and increased persistence in woolies. And so these subpopulations, the roots, the ones on the shoots, the ones on the pruning wounds, can encounter different conditions, natural enemies, and also can be differentially addressed with spraying. So what they were hypothesizing or thinking was that restricting movement between the subpopulations could reduce aphid persistence and abundance. And they did a field study and used sticky barriers to restrict upward movement to the tree canopy. So the overall thinking with woolly apple aphid is that they overwinter on the roots and then they move up the tree into the canopy. So in the greenhouse, they also did a similar study, but they were actually looking at the differences between different mulches and sand amendments to see if that could potentially restrict downward movement to the roots. In the field, what they found is that blocking upward movement did not decrease canopy colony numbers. And instead, those sticky banded trees had higher colony counts late in the study. So why was this? Well, they found that the sticky bands excluded predators like earwigs of the woolly apple aphid from the tree canopies. And in the greenhouse, they found that fewer root galls occurred on trees in sandy potting media and those with mulch. So what the overall conclusion was is that the upward movement of woolly apple aphid is less important than other factors affecting above ground aphid population dynamics, and that apple orchards potentially with sandier soils or mulches may have partial protection from root feeding by woolly apple aphids. I think it's important to have a major caveat whenever thinking about Washington state-based studies because it's a totally different environment. It's an irrigated desert, and we're more like a rainforest. Not that we're having rain all the time, but our humidity level is just much higher, and plants just generally grow in more abundant manners. Just overall, we are lush and green compared to the West Coast, meaning that ultimately there's a lot of places for insects to live outside of the orchard. So I don't think throughout New York State there's a ton of sandy soils. That seems lesser common from my just cursory look around. So I'm not sure that sand amendments or mulch would be an answer for our environment, but it is interesting to think about their use of the sticky barriers to restrict upward movement, because I think a lot of what we're seeing in the lab and having discussions about this year, a lot of what we have previously talked about woolly apple aphid seems to be being turned on its head. There are lots of predators and also parasitoids out there. It's just, what are we spraying to keep them off of the woolies and keep them from being not successful in limiting woolly success? So that leads me to a second paper, also from the same lab in 2019, titled Woolly Apple Aphid Generalist Predator Feeding Behavior Assessed Through Video Observation in an Apple Orchard. So it is commonly true across systems that there is efficacy with biological control agents, and particularly generalist predators in agroecosystems. They tend to be more successful in more organic or low input systems. However, across systems, we see that generalist predators can have a strong biological effect. However, observing them in the field doing what they do is very difficult. And so this lab group used video recordings to observe colonies of woolly apple aphid and their predators. In the study, they released European earwigs into the study area as the target for observation, and they looked at about 1,400 hours of video recorded over 4 weeks. They found that the earwigs made the most attacks on aphid colonies, but coccinellids, or ladybugs, or the spotted red round beetles that you may or may not be familiar with, but I'm sure you are, those larvae spent more total time attacking due to longer individual attacks. And they found that antagonistic interactions between predators were actually rare. And so the idea is that these predators are generalists, and they're not just going to only eat aphids, they can eat whatever is moving. In particular, they mention that ants were hindering some of the earwig behavior and reducing earwig aphid attack rates. But overall, the results were suggesting that the ladybug larvae and the earwigs had very different feeding behaviors, and overall that ants may hinder biological control by antagonizing earwigs. So another major difference between the West Coast and the East Coast is that the ants are much more voracious and much more of a problem when it comes to biological control, because they tend to recruit high numbers to tend to aphid colonies because they are benefiting from feeding on that white substance that looks like wool. And another big difference with biological control, and particularly generalist predators that feed on pest insects on the East Coast, is that, remember how I mentioned that we're like a rainforest and we have more plants? There's so many other things to be interacting with than sticking around in the orchard. And also in the orchard, there's a heavy use of pesticides of varying kinds and varying degrees of strength. And so it doesn't always lend well. That being said, we've looked at a lot of colonies this year. And early in the season, inside of the colonies, we were finding the parasitoid Aphelinus molly. Sometimes we would find the actual wasp in the colonies, in addition to parasitized woolies. But we would also find syrphid larvae. So syrphids are flies that look like bees, and they hover. So their common name is hoverflies. And they hover around, and they have a really characteristic flight. But as a whole, syrphids are very voracious general predators. So finding those in the colonies was surprising. I think in New York, we have biological control. We have generalist predators. I think it's all about thinking about how can we sustain those populations and make sure they're not affected by treatments for other things. And additionally, think more about what works best and can they be supplemented to reduce the overall impact of the pest. And that's all I have for this week. Next week or the week after, we may be having a guest. But as of right now, looks like guests are coming more so in late July. And we will be talking to a couple people, one from the West Coast about this biological control idea and what they're doing out there. And we'll also talk about adjuvants in another episode. So I'm really looking forward to those. Hope you all have a great week.
All right. Welcome to another edition of Scaffolds Pathology Update. It's 6/16/2024. And I've been looking around at all of my poorly managed plots or plots that were well managed, but are just big bushy trees. And I'm seeing some things. I'm seeing some things also on my high density trees that were managed with pretty good materials on a 5 to 7 day schedule. And it's getting things are getting kind of interesting. There's a lot of infections on cluster fruit that looks like they're finally showing up from those bloom petal fall excessive rains. It might be important to take a look through your different plantings, send out a little bit of scouting, and make sure that none of the fruit deep in the interior of the canopy are sporting well-developed lesions. I didn't see these a week before, but I'm seeing them now. They'll be a velvety, sort of brown. They can be dark black, but they're already starting to sporulate and can cause problems later on. These lesions should be burned out if you have any. Here are my best options. I would recommend maybe a potassium bicarbonate plus the weekly heat. What's the weekly heat? Well, it's this heat wave that's going through the state of greater than 85-degree weather. This will help burn out the apple scab lesions for you. There's not a lot of rain. It's excellent time. You don't have to rush the cleanup. You can let the heat and maybe even something like potassium bicarbonate do it for you. It works really well, low potential of injury, and good mildew control. So get in there and take a look around. If you still have applications of groups 7 and 11 left, you could also go in with a Luna Sensation or Maravon plus the weekly heat. Should take that out as well, and also do double duty on mildew control that I'll talk about later. Oxidate 5.0 is another excellent material to burn out the lesions, potentially with a weekly heat as well. But given that it's several concentrated hydrogen peroxides and peroxidic acids, I'm a little anxious for the potential of injury. You got all the time in the world. It's going to be all warm and not a lot of rain. A good opportunity to take this out. I already mentioned a little bit of powdery mildew. I'm seeing some very disturbing things with powdery mildew. The primary infections are abundant in many of the orchards, and it almost looks like secondary infections or primary infections themselves that were quiescent have come and they've claimed the terminals. If you go out into an orchard and you see a tree where every terminal seems to be blighted and it's kind of off-white or gray, maybe looks like a fried calamari that you might get at a restaurant with all the tentacles because the terminals stopped growing. This could be a primary. I didn't see these things early on. I only saw them after the shoots started developing in full and earnest. You might see fully developed leaves that have somehow shriveled up, looked blighted, and died. This is due to that hot, dry weather with all the humid mornings and evenings that's coming up. And previously, it's just going to drive these infections early on. We had a lot of early season relative humidity, and typically it's been sort of cold, but with all the humidity and it's been wet, but not too dry, and really allowed to get the powdery mildew a foothold. There have been some hot periods enough to get it going, and then a lot of humidity to allow it to start to take out shoots. And some of my highly susceptible Ida Reds, every shoot has stopped growing. They've all been completely blighted with powdery mildew. And I'll talk about how to determine if it's powdery mildew or fire blight that you have to worry about. If these are showing up and you're seeing these in your highly susceptible blocks, particularly along the lake, let's burn them out along with any apple scab that might have escaped it. The Luna Sensation or Maravon, if you have those options list, are some of the best single site fungicide options for getting rid of powdery mildew. That group 7-11 combination is absolutely fantastic. I also mentioned before using potassium bicarbonate for apple scab works pretty well on apple scab spores, low injury potential, and mildew control. It's one of the few materials that's allowed in a greenhouse to control powdery mildew and one of the best mildicides out there. You could go sulfur, but with this weekly heat, That's going to really exacerbate the mildew with all the heat and dry weather that we're having. I'm also a little bit worried about sulfur injury. Once things get about over 85 degrees, the chance of injuring with sulfur becomes higher. What we don't want to do is damage the fruit finish in an effort to save your terminals. Now, speaking of terminals and fire blight, this is one of the few seasons I've seen insusceptible crops. All this heat, all the heavy rains, and the humidity that we've been having in the evenings and the mornings sort of led to this devastating powdery mildew that's even been able to outcompete fire blight. And you could have both on the same tree, and it can kind of look a little bit confusing. The powdery mildew blighted shoots will stop. There won't be any flowers on them. They'll kind of look like that fried calamari look with all the little tentacles at the end, except those are your fried terminal leaves and the death of growth. Now, fire blight, what you're going to want to look for in this case is that crook, the little crooking thing, and the actual presence of blighted blossoms. So I've seen both on the same tree, such as these Ida Reds. You can see the powdery mildew aren't at all associated with flower clusters or fruit clusters that have died. They're always these terminals that sort of just ended and shriveled up and just stopped growing altogether. Now, what I have seen is one of the fewest, rarest things ever is powdery mildew is blights have stopped fire blight from growing. That's good. Fire blight's not able to move systemically through this tree because it's not growing. It needs an actively growing, functioning tree. But if your tree is also not growing and all the terminals are dead, that's not going to be good for the winter as well. So it'll be important to watch out for both of these things. Different scenarios you might see. Remember, keep a look for the crook and the blighted flowers. Those are going to be your fire blight. If the tree still has powdery mildew blighted terminals that look like a little puffed, where all of the opening leaves did develop, but then turn into sort of blighted calamari looking like fingers, it's sort of your mildew. So crook, blighted flowers, that's your fire blight, and mildew. Watch to see if it's vigorously growing. A few of mine now are starting to come out and put out some new shoot growth. So if this fire blight were to get more activated in the new shoot growth, you might need to sort of deal with that. So once again, if it's a flower cluster, fire blight. If it looks like shoots with no flowers and they're kind of curled up on the ends, but not in the crook, that's your powdery mildew, etc. So what about fire blight? I'm seeing it showing up in a lot of my high density plantings, even when there's no evidence of bloom, post bloom, petal fall infections. Everything looked clean. Things look really good. And I'm kind of worried with the weekly heat that's coming and the heat that we've just experienced at the end of the last week, these sort of cryptic or quiescent infections that were present and maybe really low numbers could become really active and move. If you have a dryish that looked like an active shoot, but sort of dry and kind of crispy shoot blight, I've been electing myself not to prune these out. I don't want to stimulate the growth if we're going to get hot and dry. I want to kind of still bait these out, but when I did put some perhexadione calcium on my high density plantings at only 3 years old, I went ahead and went full on 12 because I know these things are typically high vigor and they've been growing a lot, 12 ounces per 100. And I put on a liquid copper to kind of dry that out. You want those liquid coppers that mix well, have a post-bloom application allowance, and then I'm leaving it. These look kind of dry and crispy, I'm leaving it. If you have an oozing shoot, look down the length of your shoot. Look for ooze droplets. If it's oozy, squishy, and soft, you might think, wait, I might need to go ahead and make that perhexadione calcium with the liquid copper, give it 5 days, and try to pick the driest day possible that's hopefully not so hot, and prune it until you hit terminal bud set. You want to get to that terminal bud set when the tree naturally stops growing, and that should be a good point to be safe from fire blight. And looking at these things, if you take a look at a tree and you see a high density tree and you see a couple flag shoots, follow it. You might be deciding whether or not to cut and where to cut. Follow it down to the leader and see where it's going. Get in there and take a look and see how far it goes. See if the blight stops a couple of seasons of growth before the main leader. And what I would recommend, if you are going to cut it out, follow it down there to that last maybe inch or so, and then cut it. Even if you can get through multiple seasons of wood, even better. And if you do it on as dry, as cold as possible. Again, follow the thing down, look for the ooze. Also check to make sure seemingly healthy tissues don't have ooze, and go as close to the leader as possible. But I recommend leaving the tiniest stub just to let those tissues dry out and die in this really hot weather. And with that, that's all I've got for this week. Next week, we'll talk about some summer fruit diseases, I'm hoping, and maybe some canker diseases coming up as we hit to the end of the scaffold season.
And now for the State of the State, your weekly roundup of phenology and degree day accumulations from the major fruit production regions of the state. I'm Anna Wallace with the New York State IPM program at Cornell, and as usual, I'll be sharing information from the regional specialists and my own observations. The beginning of June started out with cooler than average conditions. Last week we saw highs in the 70s and low to mid 80s in most places across the state, and very little precipitation. This week, as you know, we're moving into quite a big heat wave, which Monique already talked a little bit about on the podcast. We've had very little precipitation recorded at NEWA weather stations across the state. On Monday evening, a quarter of an inch or so was recorded in some isolated locations, but in most places it's been very dry. Looking to the forecast, the NOAA Climate Prediction Center for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks continue to forecast much, much warmer and slightly drier or similar to average precipitation for the next couple of weeks. With regard to the heat wave, in addition to the accelerated pest activity and other effects on pests, we encourage you to take breaks and stay hydrated and cool as much as possible as you're out working in the orchard this week. In addition, there's a lot of irrigation going out, particularly for young, high-density plantings, so continue to pay attention to that. You may also want to pay attention to sunburn. As fruit approaches 40 millimeters in diameter, it begins to become susceptible. There are a few different kinds of sunburn, which are related both to heat and photooxidative conditions, which is exposure to UV radiation. We'll include a link in the show notes to a couple of resources on sunburn. Looking at phenology across the state now, it seems that different regions across the state are pretty close to each other. It's a pretty compressed season. We continue to be well ahead of degree day averages this season, as we know. In the earliest locations, like the Hudson Valley, we are seeing fruit up to 40 millimeters in size, depending on variety, location, and the thinning that was done. Cherries are harvesting in early varieties. Peaches and nectarines are continuing to size and color. Strawberry harvest is in full swing, and other berries are starting to ripen as well. In the rest of the state, in western New York, the Lake Ontario region, the Capital region, and in the Champlain Valley, things are right behind that, maybe a week or a little bit more, with fruit just slightly smaller and slightly less advanced in phenology. Now looking at some upcoming pest events and pest activity. We continue to see plum curculio fresh wounds in unmanaged sites, and so now that we're well beyond the period where those insects would be moving into the orchard, if they weren't controlled during that period, they will continue to be active and feed on fruit. Thinking about the Lepidopteran complex, codling moth flight has tapered, but we're continuing to see some moth activity, remembering that the first insecticide targeting larvae should have gone on around 200 to 250 degree days, base 50, after the biofix. And so we're past that and the second application, which would have been 10 to 14 days after the first application. Oblique-banded leaf roller trap captures continue in places where we have active populations. This week would be a good timing for most places across the state for the first application targeting this insect. Remembering that the first insecticide application should be approximately 350 degree days, base 43, after the biofix, and then a second spray should be made about 10 to 14 days later. And that's for areas where we know there are active populations and there's been history of damage in the past. In places where there hasn't been history, you can be monitoring growing terminals at 600 to 700 degree days, base 43, after the biofix to see if they're present in your orchard. Apple maggot is another pest to be thinking about now. It feels a little bit early because historically guidance has been to put traps out around the beginning of July. But with everything early this year, we're encouraging people to be looking and putting traps out a little bit early for everything. The first trap capture was reported for Massachusetts last week at the end of the week. So we know that the insects are beginning to be active at this time of year. Fruit is actually not susceptible at this stage, and females will begin to move into the orchard, but they take a couple of weeks to mate and start laying eggs. So we are beginning to think about trapping, and we'll be continuing to monitor our traps, but know that fruit is not susceptible at this stage. We're getting more and more reports of aphids in the orchard, both green apple aphids and rosy apple aphids, so be inspecting your orchards for that. Woolly apple aphid continues to be active as well. It seems to be somewhat location dependent. We're seeing more and more colonies moving to the leaf axils in more locations now. We're seeing the first signs of leaf hoppers, both potato and white apple leaf hopper, in some locations in the Hudson Valley and further north, so you can be looking for hopper burn on those new shoots. San Jose scale crawlers are emerging now, so if you have double-sided tape around your trees to be looking for those active crawlers, you should be checking that now. Mites will be active around this time and probably exacerbated by the hot temperatures, especially with the dryness and dust. We saw a couple of outbreaks or had reports early this week already of European red mites in a few locations. In addition to being out looking for these pests, you can be using sequential sampling to determine if you need to have a treatment. In addition to being on the lookout for mites in your orchard, you can also be using sequential sampling to determine if you've met the threshold for treatment in your orchard. In June, we use a threshold of 2.5 mites per leaf, which means in each leaf that's sampled, if you have more than 2.5 mites per leaf, we call that positive. You would sequential sample by taking a sample of 20 leaves from a few different trees, detecting if there's presence or absence of mites, and then using a chart in the Cornell guidelines to determine if you're above or below threshold or if you need to continue sampling. Apple leaf curling midge is another emerging pest that we've heard more and more reports of in locations throughout the state. We're seeing curled, hardened leaves and the orange nymphs that appear right before they begin to pupate and drop to the ground. So you can be looking for those curled leaves in your orchard. We're getting more and more reports of borers in trap captures over the past couple of weeks. So that's dogwood borer as well as peachtree borer and lesser peachtree borer. These are really similar looking insects, so it's important to get a good identification on them. Looking now at some diseases. We are continuing to get reports of fire blight strikes across the state. A few locations where we know that it slipped through. Overall, it looks like things have been very well controlled in most locations across the state. But stay vigilant, particularly in these really warm conditions coming up. In new plantings in particular, there are still many open flowers, which will continue to be vulnerable. Primary scab season is obviously well past at this point, but we continue to see lesions in unmanaged blocks and in a couple of locations where blocks are managed, where it slipped through. So stay vigilant so you can stay on top of secondary infections. We're seeing more and more powdery mildew, which makes sense with the very warm, humid weather, but dry conditions. So be continuing to look for that in your orchard and staying covered. We're also continuing to see rust active in orchards where it's a problem. Both leaf lesions, bright orange leaf lesions, as well as lesions on the fruit where it is present. With regard to summer diseases, both sooty blotch and fly speck, as well as rots, we are not seeing a lot of activity yet, but we know that there have been some infection events, so make sure you're staying covered and looking for symptoms of those. A quick update for cherries and berries. We continue to detect spotted-winged Drosophila, sustained trap captures at this point across most of New York State. Again, this is a little earlier than usual, but expected given the early wet spring conditions. Most trap captures are low in many locations on both red sticky cards as well as jar traps. But in some locations where we've been detecting them for several weeks now, those populations can accelerate really quickly, and we are getting really high trap captures in a few locations. As you're managing that insect, make sure to be rotating your chemistries to preserve the tools that we have available. Again, we've posted the quick guide for insecticides on the Cornell Fruit Resources page, and you can use that as a guideline for selecting chemistries. And just a reminder, if you haven't already, sign up for the new Berry Pest Monitoring Network. This is where we are posting all of the updates for spotted-winged Drosophila, as well as additional pests that we are monitoring in berries, including cherry fruitworm, cranberry fruitworm, and blueberry maggot. During the 2024 season, we will continue to provide updates on both the spotted-winged Drosophila blog as well as the berry pest blog, but we will be transitioning to the new blog in the future, so make sure that you switch over if you're interested in continuing to get those updates. Over the next couple of weeks, there are a lot of great field meetings going on, so be sure to be paying attention to the regional newsletters and alerts to get announcements about those events. This week, there are a couple of weed management workshops going on Thursday and Friday. This is in the Capital Region in the Champlain Valley. We have a second virtual orchard scout training that's taking place next Tuesday, June 25th, and that's in the afternoon. No registration is required. We'll include a link to the Zoom meeting in the show notes. Similar to the first training, Mike Bastow, Janet Van Zorn, and I will be broadcasting live from orchards in our region, and we'll be reviewing some scouting and monitoring techniques for economically significant pests in orchards. There are 1.25 DEC credits available for that training. And now here are the current degree days in the major fruit-producing regions of the state. We've been updating this information based on previous work done by Art Agnello related to Macintosh phenology and degree days, base 43 Fahrenheit. In Geneva, we're at 1,191, Highland at the Hudson Valley Research Lab, 1,282, Clifton Park, 1,156, Peru, 1,002, Medina, an inland site, 1,172, Appleton North, a lake site, 1,043, Fairville, the apple shed, 1,113, and Williamson, a lake site, 1,116. That's all for now, and stay cool until next week.